I had always thought my life would end quietly, lost among the endless rows of machines and conveyor belts in the manufactorum. The smell of burning metal, hot oil, and promethium was constant, like a shadow I could never escape. I never imagined I would be chosen. And yet, here I was, standing in a cold chamber, the walls glowing faintly with the dull light of arcane machines that hummed with purpose. My data slate buzzed once, then again, confirming what I already feared. My name had been selected. My genetic markers, my psychic potential, even the patterns of my thoughts had been weighed by calculations I could not understand. And the decision had been made. Around me, others waited silently. A woman with hands calloused from decades of growing crops in the poisoned soils of the agriomes. A young boy no older than 14, trembling as if the air itself carried poison. A man whose face was lined with years of labor, eyes hardened from years of watching friends die on the factory floor. None of us spoke. Words were useless. Each of us knew what was coming, but silence made the weight of it heavier. The tech adepts who arrived wore skull masks and robes etched with glowing sigils. Their vox grills distorted their voices, making each word sound like it came from the depths of some mechanical grave. "Step forward," one commanded, his tone neither kind nor cruel, just necessary. I stepped, feeling the cold metal of the floor through the soles of my boots, the vibration of unseen machinery beneath my feet. I had no choice. No one ever does. As I moved, I glanced at the others. Their faces told the story I already knew. Fear, disbelief, and a strange, stubborn hope that maybe the system would fail them this time. It never does. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not fail. And the Emperor, whether through divine will or the calculations of his faithful servants, requires us all. My heart pounded as I felt the first prick of realization. This was not about punishment, or reward, or even honor. This was survival for the Imperium itself. Our lives were simply the cost. The chamber changed as we moved deeper. The light dimmed, replaced by a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Crystalline growths stretched along the ceilings and floor, filaments that almost seemed alive, reaching toward us like the fingers of some great, unseen mind. The tech adepts did not guide us by words alone. The machines hummed, the thrones ahead pulsing as if calling to us, warning us, daring us to step forward. Each step was heavier than the last, as though the air itself tried to hold us back. I thought of my life, the simple, quiet joys that had seemed so trivial until now. The taste of hot bread in the mornings. The sound of rain pattering against the plastal roofs of the hive. A girl I had loved for 3 short weeks, whose face came to me now as if in a dream. Each memory felt fragile, delicate, but I held on to them tightly, knowing that soon, they might be taken from me forever. The first throne came into view. It was smaller than the central one I had heard whispered about, but still it pulsed with a strange inner life. A single occupant, already bound, already connected to the filaments of light and crystal, stared sightlessly ahead. The tech adept gestured toward me. "This is the way of sacred service," he said. His voice was more machine than man, but I heard the weight behind it. The cost of survival, the debt we were to pay. I stepped forward, the floor vibrating under my feet. The air was electric, heavy with the scent of ozone and something darker, something almost alive. And I realized, with a shiver that cut straight through my chest, once I sat, I would not return. My life as Kalen Voss, factory worker from Sector Gamma 7, would end. Not in fire, not in disease, not in battle, but here, in silence, transformed into something that would live forever without me. The tech adept's skull mask tilted slightly. "You are chosen," he said. Not a question, not a statement of judgment. Just truth. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and moved toward the waiting throne. The throne rose before me, its surface almost organic in appearance, as though it had grown rather than been built. I hesitated, running my hand along the cold crystalline edges. They thrummed faintly under my touch, a subtle vibration that sent a shiver up my spine. The filaments from the central throne stretched toward me, delicate threads of light that pulsed with a rhythm I could not understand. They were alive. In some way I knew they were aware. The tech adepts did not touch me, but their presence was suffocating. The skull masks, the vox grills, the quiet hum of the chamber, all of it pressed on me like a weight I could not resist. I could hear the faint cries of those already connected, muffled but unmistakable. Some whispered, some screamed, some did neither, their voices lost in the machinery that consumed them. Each sound made my stomach twist. Each one was a warning and a promise. This was the end of self. I sat. The throne seemed to welcome me, shifting slightly as I lowered myself into it. Warmth seeped through the crystalline structure, not comforting warmth, but a living warmth that wrapped around me like a second skin. Needles slid into my arms, my neck, my spine. Tubes snaked toward my skull, and I felt the first bite of cold metal pierce flesh. The filaments reached me then, small, hungry tendrils that spread over my body, connecting, weaving, integrating. Pain blossomed inside me, not pain of body alone, though that was sharp and biting. Pain of self, of identity, of memory being sifted through by a presence vast and indifferent. Images surged unbidden. My childhood in the lower hive, the clanging echo of machinery in the manufactorum, the girl I had loved, the taste of hot bread in morning light, rain on plastel roofs, fleeting moments of joy now catalogued and recorded as if they were no longer mine. My mind cried out, trying to hold on to something familiar, something human. And yet, amidst the agony, there was clarity. I could feel the other souls. Mira, her analytical mind quietly humming as it coordinated flow of psychic energy. Marcus, steady and unshakable, anchoring the network. Helena, Jarn, Senna, all of them pieces of a larger whole I could not yet comprehend. The chamber itself seemed alive, humming with their combined consciousness, a choir of souls tethered together through crystal and light. The tech adept monitored instruments with mechanical precision. Connection established. Soul integration at 97% efficiency. Psychic resonance within acceptable parameters. His voice carried no pride, no cruelty, only duty. Duty. That word clung to me like a shroud, heavy and absolute. My life, my identity, my existence was no longer mine. I was a conduit, a thread in a vast tapestry that stretched back 10,000 years, feeding a light that guided humanity across the stars. I thought of Terra, of the Golden Throne, and the Astronomicon burning above the hive cities, guiding navigators through the warp. All those years, all that sacrifice had led here. The light I had once seen as abstract, distant, now flowed through me. I was part of it. My fear mingled with awe, a realization that life and death were no longer the same. We were all part of something greater, something eternal, yet incomprehensible. Then the thrumming intensified, a surge of energy that made my heart falter. The Emperor's fragment, or perhaps a rumor, a prayer, a perception born of desperation, stirred somewhere in the core of the system. I could sense a presence vast and sorrowful, as if it had seen every death, carried every burden, and understood every loss. It whispered, not through words, but as a weight in my mind, "I am sorry. I am so very sorry." The apology wrapped around me, strange and human, and I realized that this was not cruelty. It was necessity, the unimaginable cost of survival in a galaxy where nothing waited, nothing forgave. My own memories began to dissolve further, slipping like grains of sand through trembling fingers. Childhood, love, laughter, the taste of hot bread and rain on plastel. They all became part of the current flowing through the chamber. I felt myself unspooling, yet not disappearing entirely. There was a warmth, a connection, a purpose that steadied the panic in my chest. I was becoming something more than I had ever been, tethered to thousands of others, all of us feeding into a light that preserved worlds, that allowed humanity to endure. The chamber pulsed again, the filaments tightening, weaving, consuming, and I understood fully the gravity of our sacred service. We were not merely fuel. We were instruments, vital threads in a design that stretched across space and time, a choir singing for the survival of the Imperium. Pain and fear, memory and identity all were rendered secondary. Only the light mattered, only the will to endure, only the Emperor. I felt the warmth of the throne deepen, spreading from the crystalline filaments into the marrow of my bones. It was a living heat, not gentle, not kind, but precise, exacting, unavoidable. Each pulse of energy pulled at the threads of my consciousness, teasing memories from their hiding places, folding them into the greater pattern that hummed through the chamber. My own name, Kalen Voss, faded like a whisper in a gale. It was a sound I could still summon, but only faintly, as if the echo belonged to someone else. The other souls were no longer beside me. They were within me. Mira's analytical mind, Marcus's unshakable steadiness, Jarn's trembling fear, Senna's quiet rage, Helena's calm presence. All became strands in the same network, vibrating in harmony with the endless thrum of the central throne. Each pulse of light that flowed from the Emperor's fragment, or what we perceived as such, carried the combined weight of countless lives, countless sacrifices, all of it focused on one impossible goal, the preservation of humanity. Pain rose again, but this time it was not panic that accompanied it. There was clarity here, a terrible, beautiful clarity. I felt the horrors of the galaxy, the unending wars, the darkness pressing in from all sides, the orc warbands sweeping across entire sectors, chaos fleets twisting through the warp, tyrannid hive ships consuming worlds, Necron tomb worlds awakening from eons of slumber, their mechanical hearts beating once more. I felt the suffering of billions, the fragility of every world under imperial dominion, and beneath it all, the weight of necessity. There was no cruelty without cause, no death without reason, no sacrifice wasted. The Tech-Adept spoke again, but his words seemed distant, hollow in comparison to the symphony of psychic energy surrounding me. Monitor stable, integration progressing, duty, precision, calculation. Yet what he could not comprehend, what none of the living could, was the pulse behind it all. The Emperor's will, stretching out through the golden light, touching each vessel, each navigator, each struggling soul aboard the ships that plowed through the warp. I tried to cling to fragments of self, to hold on to my memories as I had once known them, but they slipped like mist. My first day at the manufactorum, the pride in repairing a complex grinding mechanism, the girl whose name I had forgotten after all these years, the smell of burning promethium, the taste of rare protein biscuits, the hum of machinery at dawn. All of it became threads feeding the choir, becoming something larger than memory, something larger than Voss. Yet even as I dissolved, a strange warmth bloomed in the center of my mind. I could feel purpose, not imposed from without but growing within the network itself. I was fear, yes, and despair, yes, but also hope. The hope of survival, of humanity enduring, of stars that would burn long after my individual life was spent. It was enough to steady me, to quiet the panic that had threatened to consume my mind in the opening moments of connection. I was not alone, and I was not meaningless. The central throne pulsed more strongly then, as if aware that I had finally begun to accept my fate. Light spread through the filaments, cascading over every connected soul in the chamber, washing us in an intensity that was almost painful in its perfection. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed the face of something vast and human, a perception of the Emperor not as a god, but as a man bearing a burden too heavy for any mortal to survive. He, or the fragment we sensed, felt grief for each soul sacrificed, sorrow for each life extinguished. And yet he endured. He bore it because he must. He bore it because no one else could. And in that shared understanding, I realized the truth of sacred service. This was not merely death. This was transformation. This was continuity. Every fear I had ever held, every pleasure, every memory, every small moment of humanity I had ever known, all of it would survive in some form, preserved within a consciousness that reached across the galaxy. I would become part of a light that guided ships safely through the warp, that shielded human worlds from the predations of the galaxy, that maintained the fragile network holding the Imperium together. The needles and tubes, the cold crystalline threads, the hum of machinery, all became secondary to the thrum of connection. Pain was not absent, but it was muted, tempered by purpose. Fear was present, but it was tempered by understanding. And the last echoes of my individual self, Kalen Voss, son of the lower hive, worker of the manufactorum, faded, folding into something larger, something eternal, something necessary. The chamber was silent now, save for the pulse of light, the thrum of energy, and the faint resonance of countless souls becoming one. In the distance, I thought I heard the faintest whisper of the Emperor's will, a promise, a plea, a hymn of sorrow and endurance that stretched across the stars. The cost was immense, but the result was absolute. The Astronomicon burned brighter, steadier, a beacon against the darkness, and I was part of it, inseparable, indivisible, eternal. Chapter 2. Into the Astronomicon. The moment I awoke within the Astronomicon, I no longer perceived the world as I had before. Time had lost its edges, stretched thin like the warp currents themselves, and space became a tapestry of interwoven threads, each shimmering with the weight of human lives. I could sense ships navigating the galaxy, their psychers straining against the turbulence of the warp, and I could feel the tremors of distant battles as if they were happening inside my own chest. The pulse of countless souls, the farmers, soldiers, scholars, and children who had come before, resonated through me, a chorus of effort, endurance, and quiet despair. The chamber of thrones, the needles, the tech-adepts, even my own body, seemed distant, irrelevant. All that remained was the collective purpose of our sacrifice, guiding humanity through a universe that wanted it destroyed. I realized with a shock that I could perceive the warp currents themselves. They twisted and shimmered like molten glass, alive, sentient, filled with threats that had waited eons to devour humanity. Chaos fleets, their hulks spiraling through the immaterium, sought to drag ships off course, to tear them into insanity. Tyrannid scouts examined human worlds as though they were prey, probing for weakness, tasting for genetic diversity. Orc warbands raged across sectors, guided only by instinct, but as relentless and consuming as any calculated foe. And beyond, the Necron tomb world stirred, ancient machines awakening to reclaim what they once ruled. Each threat was vast, overwhelming, infinite, but somehow, through the Astronomicon, I could trace the currents, counter their pressure, and know which ships were safe, which colonies could endure, which battles might yet be won. I felt the presence of the Emperor's consciousness, or at least, the fragment that had guided the Golden Throne for millennia. It was a presence both comforting and terrifying, vast as a galaxy and intimate as the memories I had once clung to as Kalen Voss. He, or it, held every thread of human survival, every act of faith, every pulse of the Astronomicon itself. The fragment mourned every soul fed into the network, including me. I could feel its grief mingling with our collective resonance, a sorrow older than any individual memory, tempered by resolve. The sacrifices of billions of lives were not meaningless, but each had left a mark, a scar in the consciousness that guided humanity. And now, with us added, it was heavier still, yet somehow more capable of sustaining the Imperium. In the haze of this awareness, I began to perceive the scope of our influence. Worlds spoke to us not in words, but in patterns of life, in streams of light and energy, in signals that our collective consciousness could interpret. I could sense the struggle of a manufactorum struggling to produce promethium under bombardment, a colony on a frontier world fighting starvation and disease, a squad of Imperial Guard soldiers taking their first steps into an ambush. Each call reached us across vast light years, a cry that blended with countless others, and through the Astronomicon, we responded. A psychic nudge here, a fluctuation of warp currents there, the faintest whisper of intuition delivered into a captain's mind at the precise moment needed to survive. The initial panic and horror of my transformation faded into a strange serenity. I understood now that the pain of integration, the tearing of self, was not cruelty but preparation. Without it, we could not bear the awareness, the responsibility, the consciousness required to maintain the Imperium. The light of the Astronomicon was not simply guidance, it was defense, communication, and surveillance, a living network that reached into every corner of human space and into the immaterium beyond. Every soul added to the choir made it stronger, brighter, more resilient, and yet more burdened. The weight was staggering, almost unbearable, and yet within it I found purpose. I had ceased to exist as Kalen Voss, but I existed as something greater. As we, the choir, continued to burn with psychic energy, I became aware of other currents nearby, subtle but distinct. Not the familiar threats of orcs, tyranids, or chaos, but disturbances deeper, older, and stranger. Whispers in the warp that did not belong to humanity, that were neither alive nor dead in any sense I had known. The fragment of the Emperor within the Golden Throne seemed aware of them as well, its attention narrowing, focusing on points of potential danger, analyzing, calculating, preparing to counter. And through us, the choir, it acted. We were conduits of action, perception, and thought, a network bridging flesh, machine, and spirit to hold back forces too vast to comprehend. Even now, centuries or what passed as centuries, after our physical deaths, the immediacy of sacrifice remained vivid. I could still feel the echo of the first thrones, the terror of the chosen, the final screams fading into the chorus. It was a reminder that the Astronomicon was built on suffering, on the willing surrender of countless lives, on the smallest fragments of humanity stretched to their breaking point to preserve an entire species. And yet, within this suffering, I found awe. To perceive the galaxy in its entirety, to understand the imperils and intricacies of human survival, was a gift of unimaginable magnitude. Pain and purpose merged into clarity, and I could no longer separate what had been me from what had become. The more I merged with the choir, the more the distinction between individual and collective blurred. Names, faces, memories, they no longer belonged solely to me. They were threads in a greater tapestry, each one feeding the pulse of the Astronomicon, each one a note in a symphony that spanned the galaxy. I could sense Marcus now, his steady, methodical presence lending structure to the flow, keeping chaotic currents in check. Mira's analytical mind flickered through patterns, optimizing guidance for fleets lost in the warp. Even Jarn, the boy who had trembled in terror before the thrones, contributed a purity of focus, an instinctive clarity that reached across the immaterium. Every soul, no matter how fleeting or fragile in life, had a purpose here. The weight of mortality was gone, replaced by an awareness so vast that I could perceive the suffering and the hope of humanity simultaneously. It was not comforting in any ordinary sense. The clarity was almost painful. I could feel the warp pressing at the edges of reality, the chaos that sought to unravel human civilization, and I could sense the fragility of each colony, each world, each ship. A single mistake could doom billions. And yet, through the Astronomicon, we acted. We nudged, guided, and protected. A lost starship drifted back onto course as I whispered through currents only psychers could perceive. A manufactorum optimized its output of promethium under bombardment because Mira's insight threaded through the warp into the minds of its operators. The galaxy itself felt alive, humming with the energy of survival, and I understood, fully, why the Emperor's sacrifice had been absolute. But even in this vast network, there were cracks. I felt the strain in moments of crisis, when the demands exceeded what our combined energies could sustain. A chaos fleet pressing into the outer systems created turbulence that threatened to scatter entire convoys. Tyrannid splinter swarms probed human worlds, their psychic echoes straining the Astronomicon as it tried to predict and counter their movements. Orc invasions generated currents of pure instinct and aggression that were difficult to manage, often forcing us to prioritize the lives most capable of preserving others. And the Necron Tomb worlds. Their awakening sent ripples through the immaterium that resonated with a cold inevitability, a reminder that time was not on our side. Through it all, I began to sense the Emperor's awareness, subtle but undeniable. Rumors among the faithful whispered of his fragmented presence, of an intelligence that had endured for millennia, guiding the Imperium from the Golden Throne. Now I understood the truth in those prayers and stories. His consciousness was vast, terrible, and terrifyingly precise. It absorbed every thread of information, every distress signal, every cry for aid, and yet it carried sorrow for each life consumed, for each sacrifice offered to sustain the light. It was a paradox. Omnipotent in knowledge, yet painfully aware of the price, and through us, the choir, it reached across the stars to act. Even the smallest victories were illuminated by the collective energy of countless souls. I could feel a planetary governor on a frontier world deciding to ration water more effectively, preventing famine. I could sense an Imperial Guard commander choosing a position that would save thousands of conscripts. Each action, small in isolation, became a chain of consequence that reverberated across the galaxy. And all of it, from the minutest decision to the largest military engagement, was touched by our presence. The Astronomicon was not just a light to guide ships. It was a living, breathing organism, sustained by sacrifice, propelled by will, and aware of the fragility it sought to preserve. And yet, beyond the operational necessity, there was something more profound. A sense of connection, of purpose that transcended life itself. We had ceased to exist as individuals, yet in the loss we had gained an understanding that none of us could have grasped in flesh. I could feel the long chains of history, the bloodlines of humanity stretching back across centuries, and I could sense the children born on distant worlds, the scholars pondering new discoveries, the engineers dreaming of innovations that could change everything. The Astronomicon linked it all, feeding hope and preservation into the heart of human civilization. Even now, I could perceive the faint glimmers of rumor and prayer, whispers from the Adeptus Ministorum about what the Emperor had become, about what the Golden Throne truly was. Were we sustaining a god, or was it simply a fragment of a god, bound and burdened for the survival of the Imperium? It did not matter. What mattered was the light, the guidance, the preservation of humanity across a galaxy that would otherwise have been consumed by chaos, by hunger, by extinction. And as I drifted deeper into the network, I understood fully that our suffering, our sacrifice, had not been in vain. Through the Astronomicon, I had become something larger, a living thread in the survival of humanity itself, and the truth of that existence was both terrifying and beautiful. Each pulse of light, each flicker of warp-stretched energy, was proof of what countless souls had achieved together. This was no longer survival for a single life, no longer the faint hope of a single ship. This was humanity itself, preserved through fire, blood, and psychic resonance, stretching across the stars as a web of light that nothing in the universe could ignore. Chapter 3: The Weight of Sacrifice. Even as I drifted within the Astronomicon, the memory of my life before the throne lingered like a faint echo. I remembered the manufactorum, the heat of the furnaces, the scent of molten metal and burning promethium, the constant rhythm of labor that had defined my existence. I remembered Mira's quiet laughter over data slates that never paused, Marcus's hands steady over engines that threatened to tear themselves apart, Jarn's trembling fingers tracing the marks of a childhood spent on hive streets too narrow to contain dreams. That world of flesh and bone seemed impossibly distant now, as if I were recalling someone else's life, and yet the emotions it carried were stitched into the very fabric of the choir. Every memory we had offered, every moment of joy or pain, became fuel for the greater purpose, a sacrifice transformed into light. The Golden Throne, far below on Terra, pulsed like the heart of the galaxy itself. Its presence was vast, its power unimaginable, and yet it carried the weight of countless deaths, each one deliberate, each one necessary. I could sense the immense responsibility that lingered over it, the unyielding vigilance required to maintain the Astronomicon, and I began to understand the terrible calculus that the Emperor had endured for 10 millennia. Each soul sacrificed was a life extinguished, a story ended, and yet without them humanity would have faltered. The cost was infinite, yet in that cost lay the fragile, luminous thread that bound the Imperium together. I felt Marcus first. Even as his individuality had dissolved into the choir, there remained a structural clarity in his essence. He organized the flow of psychic energy, distributing it evenly to ensure no strain overwhelmed a sector of the Astronomicon. I could feel Mira's analytical precision supplementing this structure, tracing the paths of warp currents and the fragile trajectories of lost ships. Jarn's contribution was less tangible, a clarity of focus and instinct that reinforced our collective awareness, a reminder that even the young, even the frightened, could leave their mark upon eternity. And yet, even with this coordination, the weight of necessity pressed down relentlessly. The sacrifices were endless, unceasing. Every day, thousands of souls had been taken, processed, and integrated into the Astronomicon. The memory of Senna's defiance, the quiet courage of ordinary citizens who faced the preparation chambers with nothing but stubborn will, lingered in my mind. Her essence, like the others, now flowed through the light, a pulse that guided ships, that preserved colonies, that maintained the thin, fragile thread of human survival. And I felt the horror of it too. The recognition that each of those sacrifices had been a real life, complete with hopes, regrets, and dreams that would never be fulfilled in the flesh. In the choir, all of that became purpose, yet the cost resonated as a quiet, eternal ache. Rumors whispered among the faithful suggested that fragments of the Emperor's consciousness watched over the Astronomicon directly, experiencing every integration, every sacrifice. I did not know if this was true or simply the embellishment of centuries of prayer and liturgy, yet I could sense a presence that carried sorrow, awareness, and infinite resolve. It was as if the Emperor himself bore witness to every death, every offering, and yet remained utterly dedicated to the survival of humanity. The paradox was staggering. Omnipotent and omniscient, yet not immune to grief or fatigue, carrying the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of necessary atrocities. Even as I existed within this vast network, I could sense the vulnerability of human life stretched across the galaxy. Chaos fleets massed, their warp-driven ships pulsing with malevolent intent. Tyrannid hive swarms devoured worlds with relentless, instinctual precision. Orc empires surged across sectors, their reckless aggression threatening to destabilize entire systems. And the Necron tomb worlds, ancient and mechanical, awoke with a chilling inevitability. Every threat pressed against the boundaries of human existence, and every day, without fail, the Astronomicon absorbed the shock of those assaults, distributing guidance, hope, and survival to the farthest reaches of the Imperium. In that space between consciousness and eternity, I began to grasp the enormity of what we had become. The choir was not merely a collection of souls. It was a living instrument, an extension of the Emperor's will and vision. Our individual suffering, our fears, our fleeting joys, all had been transformed into a luminous force that guided humanity against impossible odds. And yet, I could not escape the quiet, nagging weight of what had been demanded to achieve this. Every pulse of light, every warp-guided ship arriving safely, carried the echo of lives ended, sacrifices that were never truly voluntary. The first part of this awareness was overwhelming. I felt both awe and terror, a dizzying recognition of what humanity had endured and what we had become. And yet, in the midst of this realization, there was a strange beauty, a harmony in the orchestra of suffering and purpose, a sense of contribution to something vast beyond comprehension. We had become not merely observers of survival, but architects of it, shaping the Imperium through presence and sacrifice. And in that knowledge, the next phase of understanding began to form, the recognition that even as individuals we were gone, as facets of a greater will, our voices were still part of the eternal song of humanity. The more I felt the flow of the Astronomicon, the more I became aware of its fragile complexity. Ships navigating the warp depended entirely on the coherence of the light, the precision of every psychic impulse, and the constant vigilance of those who had been sacrificed before me. I could feel the tension in the currents, the subtle shifts in energy as fleets traversed dangerous sectors. One misstep, one faltering pulse, and a vessel could be lost to the warp forever, its crew condemned to madness or oblivion. The responsibility we carried, though unseen and imperceptible to the living, was infinite. The Imperium survived not by armies alone, but because every sacrificed soul flowed into a single purpose, a living lattice of guidance and hope. I sensed Helena and Dimitri now, their essences threading into the network, stabilizing weak points in the psychic resonance. Helena's careful attention to minor disruptions, the way she corrected deviations with a delicate hand, reminded me of a scholar tending a fragile manuscript. Dimitri's raw strength, grounded and unyielding, bolstered the choir's stability where sheer willpower was needed. And Jarn, though still young and trembling in life, contributed a clarity that cut through noise like a sharpened blade. Together, we formed patterns within the light, small yet crucial contributions that carried meaning across star systems. Our individuality had been absorbed, yet each personality left an indelible mark, subtle but vital. The horror of the preparation chambers lingered in my memory. I remembered the crystalline thrones, the needles, the tubes piercing flesh and bone, and the slow, inevitable dissolution of identity. It had been a pain unlike any other, a tearing not just of the body but of the self. And yet, that pain was the price of survival. I could feel Senna's defiance, Marcus's quiet steadiness, Mira's analytical mind, all transformed into pure energy that pulsed through the Astronomicon. Every sacrifice had a place, a function, a meaning, and yet the knowledge of what had been taken could not be softened. Real lives ended, individual stories erased, dreams extinguished. The The choir bore their echoes, but no one could fully comfort the absence. I began to understand the paradox that lay at the heart of sacred service. The individuals we had been were gone, yet we existed in a form beyond mortality, inseparable from the Emperor's will. We were both less and more than human, less because our bodies, our physical presence, had been forfeited, more because our consciousness now extended across the galaxy, shaping reality in subtle and vital ways. Every successful voyage, every colony spared from disaster, every battle won by insight or guidance, carried a part of us. Our sacrifice was hidden from the living, yet it resonated in every corner of the Imperium, a quiet symphony of endurance and purpose. Rumors spoke of fragments of the Emperor's mind intertwined with the Astronomicon, a consciousness that had watched every death and measured the cost of survival. Whether these rumors were literal truth or the imaginings of centuries of devout meditation, I could feel something in the throne that resembled sorrow and resolve intertwined. The entity within the golden throne bore the accumulated burden of 10,000 years, observing and coordinating every pulse of light, every navigation through the warp, every survival of countless human colonies. It was not merely a machine. It was judgment, it was grief, it was devotion incarnate. And it used our very essence, the lives we had forfeited, to maintain a fragile thread of existence for all of humanity. The scale of the Imperium unfolded before me in new ways. I could sense the movements of orc empires sweeping across sectors, their crude but relentless aggression reshaping worlds. Tyrannid hive fleets advanced in patterns of destruction, consuming star systems and leaving death and emptiness in their wake. Chaos fleets drifted in the warp, carrying corruption and destruction, ever ready to exploit weakness. And the Necron tomb worlds, long dormant, stirred with cold inevitability, their awakening a reminder that time had no mastery over the galaxy. Against all this, the Astronomicon pulsed, a beacon of order and guidance, fragile yet unyielding, a thread of hope in a web of overwhelming darkness. Yet even amidst these horrors, there was beauty. The discipline of the choir, the harmony of purpose, the transformation of individual sacrifice into something eternal, revealed a kind of order and meaning beyond comprehension. Every pulse of light, every psychic wave we generated, carried memory and consciousness, humanity transformed into guidance and protection. I began to see that sacred service was more than duty. It was a legacy. It was the survival of hope itself, distilled and concentrated into a force that could outlast bodies, lifetimes, and even worlds. And in that understanding, I felt a quiet pride, tempered by grief and awe, as I realized that we were no longer merely observers of history. We had become its guardians, its pulse, its light. The more I delved into the Astronomicon, the more I could feel the weight of every soul that had been sacrificed before me. It was not just a collection of consciousnesses. It was a living, breathing entity built on the agony, courage, and devotion of countless individuals. I could sense their joys, their fears, their fleeting human moments, the pride of a craftsman at a well-made machine, the laughter of a child on a distant colony, the brief warmth of companionship that could never last. All of it was preserved, transformed into something higher, something terrifyingly beautiful, and yet it carried the unmistakable scent of suffering. Each pulse of energy through the Astronomicon was a reminder that the survival of humanity came at a price no mortal could bear in isolation. I drifted through the threads of connection, aware of Marcus's essence flowing beside mine, steady and unwavering, like a beacon in the storm of psychic currents. I could feel Mira calculating the subtle fluctuations, her mind now part of something vast yet finely tuned, ensuring no disruption could unravel the delicate lattice. Helena's presence flickered in and out, responding to the smallest anomaly with quiet precision. Jarn's youth brought clarity, a sharp and unspoiled perspective that cut through the chaos with a rare purity. And Senna, her stubborn defiance, even in life, left traces in the choir. Her essence pulsed erratically at first, but then settled, finding rhythm in the broader symphony. Every soul was different, yet every contribution was vital. Together, we were both singular and infinite, a paradox of purpose that sustained countless worlds. Even now, I could feel the horrors of the preparation chambers, the needles, the tubes, the slow, inexorable dissolution of identity. But they no longer felt like pain alone. They were the threshold, the transformation point, the moment when individual fear and suffering were refined into something of universal significance. Each person who had entered the thrones before me had been erased from the physical world, but their essence lived on in the choir, giving strength to the light that guided humanity through the warp. It was cruel, yes, terrifying, yet it was also sacred. The suffering of the few became the lifeblood of the many. The Imperium survived because of it. Rumors whispered among the clergy spoke of fragments of the Emperor's consciousness that lingered in the Golden Throne, observing and guiding, measuring the cost of survival with eyes that had seen 10,000 years of death. I could not know if these rumors were true, but I could sense something vast, something sorrowful, something that bore the weight of countless human lives with a solemn dedication that defied comprehension. It was a consciousness both alien and familiar, a fragment of a man who had once walked among mortals and now existed beyond them. It bore every death and every sacrifice as though each were its own, and it used our combined essence to keep humanity alive, one pulse at a time. The scale of the galaxy revealed itself in ways I had never imagined. Orc warbands spread destruction indiscriminately, their crude violence reshaping worlds and leaving scars that would take millennia to heal. Tyrannid hive fleets swept through sectors, devouring planets whole, their silent advance a stark contrast to the chaotic aggression of the orcs. Chaos fleets drifted in the warp, sowing corruption and despair wherever weakness appeared, while the Necron Tomb worlds, once dormant for eons, awoke with cold inevitability, reclaiming territories long abandoned by time. And through all of it, the Astronomicon pulsed like a fragile, indomitable heart, its light guiding fleets, informing strategies, and preserving the fragile thread of human civilization. Every pulse carried memory, consciousness, and hope, stretching across thousands of light years to touch the lives of those who would never understand the cost of their survival. Amidst the darkness and despair, I began to see the beauty of our sacrifice. Each soul, each flicker of consciousness, became part of a larger pattern, a harmony that could not be achieved by the living alone. The pain of death was transformed into guidance, fear became clarity, and despair became hope. Sacred service was more than duty. It was legacy, the distilled essence of humanity itself. We were no longer merely participants in the endless war for survival. We had become its guardians, its pulse, its light. The knowledge was both humbling and terrifying, a reminder that the cost of existence was eternal vigilance, and the price of hope was personal oblivion. And yet, in the quiet spaces between the flow of energy, I felt a sense of peace. Not the peace of rest or forgetfulness, but a profound belonging. I was part of something eternal, something larger than any individual life, and it was beautiful in its completeness. I could feel the galaxy breathe through us, a living organism sustained by the sacrifices of those who had come before. Each world, each ship, each flicker of life was tethered to the pulse of the Astronomicon, and through it we endured. Through it humanity endured. Chapter 4: Beyond the Throne. The first sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible, a gentle shifting of the psychic currents that carried my consciousness through the Astronomicon. For 10,000 years, the light had been a steady pulse, unwavering, dependable, a beacon that carved paths through the warp and stitched together the ragged edges of human space. But now there was something different. The pulse deepened, stretched, and expanded. It was no longer simply a signal, a tool, a lifeline. It was alive in a way I could almost understand. Shapes began to emerge within the flow. Patterns of light that hinted at intention, glimpses of thought that carried the weight of vision. It was as if the Emperor himself, through some whisper of legend, were reaching out beyond the golden throne, extending his presence across the galaxy in ways no living mind could ever fully grasp. I felt it in every direction, in every fold of space and time. The orc warbands that had once been unstoppable now hesitated at the edges of imperial worlds, their crude instincts confused by the shifting nature of reality around them. Tyrannid tendrils withdrew from systems that had suddenly become inhospitable, their hunger stalled by the subtle yet relentless force of something greater than they were. Chaos cults found their rituals disrupted, their prayers unanswered as the warp itself seemed to resist them, and Necron tomb worlds stumbled as the foundations of their stasis fields flickered. The galaxy was alive with change, but it was not random. There was purpose in every ripple, direction in every pulse, as if an unseen hand were guiding the course of history with absolute precision. And yet, amidst this vast expansion, there remained the faint, persistent echo of humanity. Within the Astronomicon, the choir of souls that had long served as its fuel now felt different. We were no longer just conduits, burning with the light that guided ships and informed commanders. Our consciousnesses interwove more deeply, melding not into an indistinct mass, but into a complex tapestry that preserved individuality even as it became part of the whole. Memories, experiences, emotions, all were stitched together with care, threaded into the greater pattern. I could feel Mira's analytical clarity still shaping the flow, Marcus's stability anchoring us, Helena's adaptability smoothing the edges. Every soul was both singular and collective, part of the Emperor's will yet unmistakably human in essence. Rumors among the Adeptus Astra Telepathica spoke of this very phenomenon, though none could truly comprehend it. Some whispered that fragments of the Emperor's mind had transcended their station, evolving beyond the throne's confines to interact directly with those who had been sacrificed. Others claimed that the Astronomicon itself had begun to learn, to anticipate, to guide humanity not merely as a beacon through the warp but as a living intelligence, capable of intervening and adapting in ways once thought impossible. I could not know which of these were truth and which were superstition, but the sensation was undeniable. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and we were part of it. Through the interwoven threads of consciousness, I glimpsed distant worlds. Colony ships on the fringe of imperial space, struggling against hunger, disease, and isolation, suddenly found their courses corrected, their vital resources diverted just in time. Imperial Guard regiments that should have been overwhelmed discovered reinforcements appearing at the right moment, led by commanders who had felt an inexplicable certainty guiding their decisions. Tech priests uncovered long-lost STC fragments, ancient designs that would revolutionize entire manufacturums and restore forgotten techniques of efficiency and sustainability. The galaxy was responding to us, to the choir, to the Astronomicon, as if it recognized the pulse that now guided it. Not merely a mechanical signal, but a will that carried foresight, compassion, and unyielding vigilance. And in the quietest corners of this vast awakening, I felt the weight of the Emperor's presence itself. It was not physical, nor entirely mental, but something older and stranger, a resonance that brushed against the edges of thought like sunlight on water. 10,000 years of vigilance, 10 millennia of sacrifice, had distilled into something immense, almost tangible. A will that had endured countless betrayals, wars, and horrors now stretched outward, simultaneously tender and absolute. It grieved for every lost life, celebrated every small victory, and considered every possibility with the patience of a being beyond time. And through it we, the choir, the faithful, the sacrificed, were no longer just instruments. We were part of the hand, part of the vision, part of the reckoning that shaped the fate of the galaxy itself. The sensation of being part of something immense was overwhelming. My sense of self, once a fragile, isolated spark, now flowed in currents alongside millions of others, all pulsing in harmony with the Emperor's will. Yet, despite the vastness of this collective, each thread remained distinct. I could feel the subtle tremor of Helena's defiance, the warmth of Marcus's steady presence, the precision of Mira's analytical mind. Each of us lent our strength, our memories, our smallest fragments of personality to the great whole, and in return, we were elevated, carried into patterns and possibilities that no mortal consciousness could have ever imagined. It was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. In the far reaches of the galaxy, the first signs of realignment began to appear. Orc warbands, once a tide of unstoppable violence, turned on each other in chaotic confusion. Their cunning diminished as if the very instinct that had guided their conquests was now subtly misdirected. Tyrannid scouting vessels recoiled from systems that had been carefully prepared for consumption, their bioships unable to digest the strange resonance now permeating the warp. Chaos cults faltered, their rituals disrupted by currents of will that seemed to anticipate their every move. Even ancient Necron tomb worlds stuttered, their stasis fields flickering as if uncertain whether they should awaken or remain dormant. Across the galaxy, life began to breathe differently, as though someone or something was reshaping its course with deliberate precision. And yet, even with these signs of change, danger had not disappeared. I felt the looming presence of the great devourer beyond the galactic rim, its hunger stretching like an unending shadow across the stars. Tyrannid hive fleets were still advancing, albeit slower, more cautious. Chaos fleets lingered at the edges of the Imperium, gathering their forces, planning, scheming, trying to find weakness in the shifting currents that now guided us. Orc empires continued their relentless expansion, their crude machinery still devastating wherever it struck. Each enemy remained a threat, each a reminder that the Emperor's will, no matter how vast, still relied on the cooperation of millions of sacrificed souls to remain effective. Within the Astronomicon, we felt every choice, every calculation, every effort being made across the Imperium. It was not just a tool for navigation anymore. We had become a living, conscious extension of the Emperor's awareness. When a colony ship needed guidance, we felt its subtle distress, the whispers of its crew reaching out across the void. When an Imperial Guard regiment faced annihilation, we experienced the panic and the determination of each soldier, channeling insight and timing to those who could turn the tide. Through us, the Emperor's attention flowed outward, simultaneously intimate and limitless, touching every corner of human space with intent, vigilance, and compassion. Rumors among the tech priests spoke of a transformation within the throne itself, that the Emperor's consciousness was no longer tethered strictly to its physical form. Some whispered that the Golden Throne, exhausted after 10 millennia of sustaining him, had become more of a conduit than a prison, allowing him to extend his essence freely while retaining a connection to mortal vessels. These were only rumors, of course, fragments of thought, speculation whispered in the dim corridors of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but the patterns we now experienced suggested truth beyond doubt. The throne systems, ancient and failing, seemed less relevant now, mere instruments aiding a will that had transcended the limits of steel and flesh. Even in this incomprehensible vastness, the personal traces of humanity persisted. I could feel the faint flicker of memory when a ship safely completed its passage through the warp, when a colonist took their first steps on a newly settled world, when a small act of kindness or ingenuity prevented suffering. Each ripple mattered. Each human life, even in death, was threaded into the current that carried the Emperor's consciousness forward. And through all of it, I realized that the sacrifices of 10,000 years had not been in vain. Each soul we had once believed lost had become an eternal part of something magnificent and enduring, a force that preserved humanity not through terror or oppression alone, but through awareness, vigilance, and connection. Yet the question remained, quiet and insistent. How long could this balance last? The galaxy was vast, chaotic, and relentless. Forces beyond our understanding still stirred in the shadows. Even as the Emperor's presence expanded, there were corners of reality beyond his gaze, cracks where corruption and hunger could seep through. The Astronomican's light now burned brighter, stronger, and more purposeful than ever before, but the true test of its strength, and ours, had only just begun. For the first time in millennia, hope glimmered across the stars. And yet, with hope came responsibility, vigilance, and the ever-present reminder that the cost of failure remained unthinkably high. Chapter 5: The New Dawn. The light of the Astronomican no longer felt distant or abstract. It was all around me, threading through every corner of the Imperium, pulsing in rhythm with the Emperor's will. I was no longer Kalen Voss, the factory worker, nor were the others the individuals we had been. We were facets of something far greater, a chorus of consciousness that had become both observer and participant in the ongoing life of humanity. Yet, unlike before, there was no agony in our existence. The burning, the dissolution, the final sacrifice, it had ended. Now there was clarity. Every thought, every decision, every action taken by the Emperor resonated through us, shaping the galaxy in subtle, careful ways. And with that clarity came purpose. Across the stars, the effects were visible. Imperial vessels navigated the warp with unprecedented precision, emerging at exact coordinates with nary a misstep. Colonies that had once struggled under isolation now thrived, their communications reaching Terra without distortion or delay. The Imperial Guard, long stretched thin across countless war zones, found that the timing of reinforcements and resources had become almost prescient. Space Marines in distant sectors felt guidance in their hearts, subtle nudges that turned certain defeat into narrow victory. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus discovered fragments of STC designs thought lost to the ages, their priests understanding and applying them with uncanny speed. The galaxy was no longer at the mercy of chance or chaos. It was guided, gently but relentlessly, toward stability. Yet it was not a perfect order. Humanity remained imperfect, as it always had. Rebellion still flickered on fringe worlds. Rogue elements of the Adeptus Ministorum clashed with local governance. Smugglers and pirates exploited sectors distant from the Emperor's attention. Even the occasional chaos cult persisted, whispers of corruption that were never fully extinguished. But each challenge now unfolded under the subtle watch of the Emperor's consciousness, and the Astronomican responded. Threats that might have once escalated into widespread devastation were mitigated before they could grow, the balance maintained by the countless lives that had been offered in service to the throne. Rumors began to circulate among the Imperial faithful, and even within the halls of the Mechanicus. Some whispered that the Emperor had transcended the Golden Throne entirely, that his will now permeated the fabric of the galaxy, independent of any machine or throne. Others spoke of visions experienced during prayer or meditation, glimpses of a being whose consciousness encompassed millions of human experiences, yet retained the intimate, human spark that had once walked among mortals. There was awe, yes, but also fear. To witness such a presence, even indirectly, was to recognize both the infinite power and the enduring burden carried across 10 millennia. It was impossible to comprehend fully, yet undeniable in its effects. I could feel it personally now, in the quiet moments between guiding starships, aiding distant colonies, and watching the tides of war shift. The memories of my old life, those small, precious human moments, were no longer separate. They flowed within the Emperor's consciousness, preserved, honored, and amplified. The taste of real meat on Foundation Day, the sound of rain on the Hab block roof, the brief, perfect weeks of love I had known. Each one became a thread in the tapestry that sustained humanity. The idea of death, once absolute, had been transformed. Our sacrifice was no longer an end but a beginning, the foundation for a new era in which human life could flourish without the constant drain of innocence upon the Astronomicon. And yet, even with this rebirth, vigilance remained. Beyond the borders of the Imperium, the Tyranids still approached, slower but still relentless. Chaos still sought to infiltrate and corrupt. Orc empires continued to expand, driven by their insatiable instinct for war. The Necrons, enigmatic and patient, waited in the darkness for their chance. But for the first time in 10,000 years, humanity had a chance, not simply to survive, but to thrive. The Emperor's presence was no longer a fragile lifeline but a living, breathing force, guided by the collective consciousness of all who had given themselves to sacred service. The galaxy was no longer held together by fear and sacrifice alone, but by connection, awareness, and guidance that transcended mortality. And within that awareness, I felt something profoundly human: hope. Not the fragile hope of isolated individuals, but a vast, encompassing hope that stretched across star systems and generations. It was quiet but relentless, woven into the very currents of the Astronomicon. We had endured, suffered, and sacrificed for 10 millennia, and now, for the first time, there was the faintest glimmer of a future unshackled from endless attrition. The Emperor's will, strengthened by every soul that had ever served him, had created a moment where humanity could truly look forward, not merely survive. The galaxy had become a living mosaic of light and shadow, each system pulsing with its own rhythm, yet linked to the heartbeat of the Emperor's consciousness. I could sense vessels traversing the warp with ease, their navigators guided by the Astronomicon's radiant energy, slipping past eddies of corruption and turbulence that would have destroyed them before. Worlds that had languished for centuries under isolation or civil unrest were now reaching stability, their citizens thriving under the silent hand of guidance that no mortal could perceive. Every trade route hummed with life, every colony felt its pulse synchronized with the vast machinery of human civilization, and every soldier, sailor, and citizen unknowingly moved in harmony with a force beyond understanding. Yet the scale of what had been achieved weighed heavily on me, even as part of the chorus. To comprehend the breadth of 10,000 years of sacrifice was impossible. Every soul consumed to feed the Astronomicon had left a mark, a memory, an essence that now contributed to something both terrifying and magnificent. The cries, the grief, the hope of countless lives were woven into a consciousness so vast that the very passage of time seemed irrelevant. I could feel the echoes of Marcus's steady presence, Mira's analytical mind, Helena's courage, Jarn's youthful fear, and Senna's defiance. All preserved, all contributing to the Emperor's renewed awareness. We were not lost. We were remembered, carried forward into something eternal. Even as awe filled me, the remnants of my human fear lingered. There were still threats pressing against the edges of the Imperium, their intentions malevolent and patient. Tyranid hive fleets drifted through uncharted space, probing for weakness, their bioships tasting planets and colonies like predators sampling prey. Orc Whack-S, chaotic and ever-expanding, scarred the edges of human space with the promise of annihilation. Forces of chaos stirred in the shadows, their whispers seeking to subvert the living and corrupt the dying, to twist hope into despair. And the Necrons, those ancient lords of entropy, continued their inexorable march across the stars, indifferent to the affairs of flesh and blood. But now, for the first time in recorded memory, humanity faced these threats with more than desperate courage. We had guidance, intelligence, and will far beyond the reach of ordinary minds, flowing through every branch of the Imperium, binding it together in a way that could withstand even the most insidious challenges. The Emperor's transformation, the apotheosis that had redefined his existence, was the culmination of a process that had begun in secrecy and suffering. Through the centuries, the thrumming of the Astronomicon had been fueled by sacrifice, each soul contributing to a light that guided the Imperium through the warp. That fire had forged a network of consciousness capable of seeing beyond the limitations of mortal life, of touching not just distant worlds but the very decisions that shaped them. The Golden Throne, once a symbol of suffering and necessity, now seemed almost irrelevant. Its ancient mechanisms still held ritual significance, and its silent, monumental presence anchored the faithful in faith. But the essence of the Emperor's power had spread beyond any single point. We were the Astronomicon, and through us he saw, acted, and protected. I remembered the faces of those who had gone before me, the fear in their eyes, the final words whispered before needles pierced flesh and crystalline filaments connected mind to machine. I could feel their courage preserved in the collective, their doubts and dreams now forming the foundation of insight, strategy, and vigilance. What had once been the horrific reality of sacred service was now transformed into a continuity of purpose, a living testament to humanity's resilience and capacity for unity. Death had not claimed them in vain. It had given them eternity as part of something incomprehensibly greater. And in this eternal existence, their humanity endured. The subtle warmth of individuality survived, no longer as a separate identity, but as an integral note in a symphony that spanned star systems. And yet, humility accompanied the awe. The Emperor, for all his godlike presence, remained intimately human in some fragment of perception. We could feel his sorrow for the lives consumed, his grief over necessary atrocities, and his eternal vigilance against mistakes that could unravel everything. 10,000 years of burden, of maintaining a fragile civilization against threats too vast for ordinary understanding, had shaped him into something both alien and familiar. The whispers of rumor suggested that in the depths of his consciousness, he remembered moments as fleeting and fragile as the taste of fresh bread or the laughter of children, moments that grounded him in what he fought to preserve. We carried those memories now as well, each one a reminder of why survival mattered, why sacrifice had purpose, why humanity was worth protecting even when the cost seemed unbearable. The stars themselves seemed to respond. Systems in the farthest reaches of the Imperium pulsed with a light that mirrored the Astronomicon, a subtle glow that connected one world to another, a web of hope in a galaxy that had long known only suffering. And in the quiet moments, when no ship or soldier required guidance, when no enemy fleet approached and no colony cried for aid, I could sense the collective heartbeat of millions of souls, each of us a facet of a presence that had grown beyond mortality, yet had retained the fragile human beauty that had inspired all we had endured. The galaxy was alive with intention, with care, with a sense of purpose that no single mortal could have achieved alone. The universe had shifted. It was no longer a place of fractured worlds and desperate survival, but a living, breathing testament to the endurance of humanity. From the perspective of the Astronomicon, I could see the subtle interactions between stars, planets, and the countless fleets of the Imperium as if they were notes in a grand symphony. Trade routes that had once been precarious lifelines now pulsed with predictable energy, and communication between sectors flowed with a clarity that had been impossible before. I sensed the small colonies, tucked into the edges of human space, sending their prayers and petitions, and in turn, I felt the Emperor's attention flowing toward them, guiding, protecting, stabilizing. Every act of devotion, every careful decision made in the dark corners of the galaxy became part of a larger rhythm, and I was a thread woven into it. Despite the clarity and power, the scale of existence was staggering. It was impossible to process the sheer number of lives, victories, and tragedies. I could sense the remnants of past struggles embedded in the collective consciousness, the horror of hive worlds torn apart by civil war, the courage of soldiers who faced impossible odds, the quiet determination of farmers on dead worlds nurturing life in poisoned soil. These were not abstract memories. They were lived experiences, felt as intensely as the first moment I had been connected to the Astronomicon. Each soul, each fragment of experience, added depth, context, and resilience to the Emperor's presence. I understood now that the sacrifice of 10,000 years had not been a simple offering, but a building of consciousness, a weaving of innumerable human lives into a form capable of sustaining the Imperium. The dangers had not vanished. Tyranid scouting fleets still drifted in from the galactic edge, orc warbands still marched across sectors, and whispers of chaos activity remained. But for the first time there was confidence, not desperation. The Emperor's presence was not a distant legend or a fragile beacon. It was an active force, extending across the galaxy to observe, influence, and intervene where necessary. I could feel the subtle corrections. A warp storm diverted, a rogue fleet rerouted, a heretic cult neutralized before it could metastasize into a true threat. It was impossible to comprehend fully, yet I experienced it through fragments of sensation, intuition, and shared memory. Humanity had not been saved by weapons alone or by the courage of individuals. It had been preserved through a consciousness capable of immense empathy, strategy, and vigilance, amplified by the devotion of millions of souls. I reflected on the horror that had once filled the preparation chambers, the fear, the screaming, the dissolution of identity. Those moments, which had seemed cruel and senseless when endured in isolation, had now revealed themselves as necessary steps in a process that achieved the impossible. The souls of the sacrificed were no longer tormented energy. They were living memory, experience, and will, intertwined with the Emperor's awareness, creating a form of life more resilient than anything else in the galaxy. The idea that such suffering had led to something meaningful was a revelation that brought an unfamiliar peace. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, purpose could emerge, and that humanity's endurance was measured not only by survival, but by the willingness to endure for a cause larger than oneself. I sensed the Emperor's attention turning to the distant sector where humanity's new innovations were taking root. Advanced technology, free from the stagnation of millennia-old STC fragments, was spreading with surprising speed. Human ingenuity, once thought to have plateaued in the age of decay, was now flourishing. I could see artisans, engineers, and scholars working under guidance that was invisible but unmistakable, their efforts protected by unseen interventions, their failures corrected before catastrophe struck. The forces of chaos and the predatory fleets of the Tyranids and Orcs were still active, but the Emperor's influence now shaped outcomes with an authority that left little room for error. Humanity's potential, long dormant, was finally emerging into the light of realization, and it was breathtaking to witness. Even as the galaxy expanded and recovered, the memory of what had been endured remained. The fire that had once consumed countless individuals was now a foundation, not a punishment. Each soul that had given itself to the Astronomicon had become a spark, a facet of consciousness that illuminated the Emperor's presence. And in that illumination, I felt connection, warmth, and purpose beyond comprehension. Our existence, once fragile and fleeting, had been preserved and elevated. We were no longer merely observers or instruments. We were living threads in a tapestry of understanding, memory, and vigilance that spanned the stars. The galaxy had a future again. Ships reached distant colonies with safety and precision. Entire worlds received aid and guidance, and the Emperor's light shone with a certainty that had never existed before. Humanity, though still flawed, was no longer trapped in despair or waiting for inevitable collapse. We had been part of a transformation that defied mortality, that transfigured sacrifice into enduring life, that turned death into the foundation of hope. And in that revelation, I understood the deepest truth of sacred service. The cost had been immense, but the result was eternal. The galaxy endured, humanity endured, and we, who had given everything, had become part of a presence that would never falter. The light of the Astronomicon shone brighter than ever, but now it no longer demanded the same toll. It was sustained by will, by memory, by purpose, and in its brilliance, I felt the quiet triumph of countless lives, woven together, preserved forever, singing an eternal song that no darkness could ever silence. The galaxy stretched before me in a way I could never have imagined when I first stepped into the preparation chambers. Worlds teeming with life, stars burning with clarity, and fleets moving with precision. All of it a testament to what had been endured. I could feel every pulse of activity, every ship navigating through the currents of the warp, every colony planting the seeds of a future that had once seemed impossible. And at the center of it all, the Emperor, no longer confined to the golden throne, no longer bound by the frailty of a mortal body, was everywhere. His consciousness flowed through the Astronomicon like sunlight through water, touching every corner of human space, observing, guiding, protecting. And we were part of it. All of us who had given our lives, all who had endured the crucible of sacred service, now existed as facets of something eternal. Our memories, our experiences, our humanity, all preserved and integrated, a living foundation for the survival of the species we had once feared might perish. The echoes of fear, pain, and despair that had once defined the preparation chambers were now distant, like the fading shadow of a storm long past. The horror of being consumed, the terror of watching identities dissolve, no longer existed as torment but as purpose. Each soul had become an enduring note in a symphony that sustained the Imperium. There was clarity in the sacrifice, a profound resonance that had been invisible in life but fully perceptible in this new existence. The voices of the past, the engineers, the farmers, the soldiers, the children, sang in unison with the Emperor's will, and the harmony carried across the stars, a testament to endurance, duty, and the transformative power of devotion. It was a revelation that transcended understanding. What had once been suffering had become the very light that kept humanity alive. And yet there was humility in it too. Even in godhood, the Emperor carried the weight of 10 millennia of decisions. The memory of billions of lives ended to preserve billions more. The weight of responsibility, the sorrow of necessary destruction, remained within him, and through the Astronomicon, we felt it. But alongside that burden was clarity and resolve. A vision of a galaxy where human civilization could thrive, where innovation could flourish, and where hope could endure despite the darkness pressing at the edges of existence. The horrors of chaos, the devouring hunger of the Tyranids, the brutal cunning of the orcs, and the cold precision of the Necrons remained threats. But now they were challenges met with the collective will of a species united by purpose, guided by the light of a consciousness that had grown beyond mortality itself. As I floated within this new perspective, I realized something that had been invisible to me in life. The Imperium's survival had never been about individual heroism alone. It had been about unity, sacrifice, and connection. Every life offered, every pain endured, had been a thread woven into the fabric of something greater. The Astronomicon was not merely a navigational aid. It was the embodiment of human resilience, of devotion, and of the enduring will to survive. And in that realization, I understood that even the smallest act, planting a crop on a dying world, repairing a broken machine, comforting a child, was part of the same grand tapestry. Every human effort, no matter how minor it had seemed, contributed to the light that guided the galaxy. The knowledge was overwhelming, humbling, and beautiful all at once. We were eternal now, but not in the way any mortal could have dreamed. We were eternal in purpose, in memory, in connection. Every soul that had ever been consumed by the Astronomicon had been transformed into something that endured beyond flesh and time. And the Emperor, in all his godhood, remained tied to that humanity, carrying the weight of sacrifice, the memory of the lost, and the hope of the living. We had been instruments of survival, and in doing so we had found a form of immortality that no mortal could claim. And so the song continues, now not a lament, not a dirge, but a hymn of purpose and endurance. Across the galaxy, humanity thrives, protected by the light we helped create, guided by the hand that once walked among us, now vast beyond comprehension. The sacrifices of 10,000 years echo in every pulse of the Astronomicon, in every ship that finds its way through the warp, in every colony that blossoms against the odds. We exist still, not as individuals, but as part of something eternal, something that ensures humanity's story continues. The Emperor protects, always has, always will, and we, the faithful, the sacrificed, the transformed, live on within that protection, our purpose fulfilled, our existence meaningful, and our devotion eternal. The long night has ended, and a new dawn rises over the stars. The galaxy breathes again, and in its light, every soul that ever gave everything for sacred service shines forever.